For the past few months, I have made it known that I and many others have had a huge real disdain for Disney live-action remakes. They are soulless cash grabs designed nothing more than being just that, banking off the public's nostalgia for these very stories. And quite recently, with the release of The Little Mermaid, it hasn't been actually achieving the numbers it was supposed to achieve at the box office, only slightly doing better than the $540 million Cinderella made in 2015, and far from the billion-dollar ones like Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, and The Lion King that this movie was supposed to make, being based off the Renaissance era, utterly failing and will likely lose a little bit of money. It's a positive sign how the world has rejected such an easy cash grab idea, despite it being a hit here in the States somewhat. But despite this, the film still received positive reviews by those who watched it, and Disney is still planning to release several other films in theaters and of course on Disney Plus to fall back on. And of course, the most egregious one out of all of them is the Moana remake coming in 2025, 2 years from now, where that would only still make it 9 years after the release of the original film, the shortest gap between an animated film and its remake that has been ever made by a big huge studio, meaning no new original movie is now safe anymore. Where I expect films like Wish to have its remake come out the very next year. It sadly puts in the reality into perspective that Disney won't stop remaking their films, or what I like to say as cannot stop remaking their films. This video is meant to address the problems and try to attempt to fix the movie schedules to at least be creative enough and try to add some value like what Cinderella did overall, the only remake that has really worked for me in the modern age. It's where you have to realize how we have reached this stage considering how many remakes they have done at this point, that would seem futile for them to stop at all, to stop barraging us with this style of film when there clearly is a large interest into seeing the films. Fan castings and whatnot are still perpetrating these notions that we want to see the original animated films being remade for some reason, even though most of the time it does serve as a disrespect to the medium. And the issue that must be presented is how they are remaking the wrong films. Yes, the popular ones is what people want to see since they're so hell-bent on butchering the Renaissance and of course making money, but there are a lot of films that would benefit from remakes that could present something quite different as a story rather than the lazy shot-for-shot style that most of them go for. For more films that seem as real as Cinderella, and it's something we'll go in later in this video because we must address the original progenitor of these remakes from the beginning to now with 101 Dalmatians. In 1996, Disney released their first theatrical remake, 101 Dalmatians, to great box office success, but of course negative critical reviews. I watched it on DVD when I was young, not wondering about or caring that it is a remake, but on rewatching it, most of the story and criticism does seem warranted, being quite bland and quite dumb compared to the original, except for Glenn Close's performance as Cruella de Vil. Her portrayal as the character was just as good or even slightly better than the original for me, and was really the reason why the movie made its name for itself. It sort of proved that you can capture the spirit of the original in one way or fashion, where it really did make use of real dogs who didn't talk unlike the original, something modern Disney remakes wouldn't do using CGI for some reason. People just felt attracted to it because it was trying to be realistic in most senses of the world, because it's a world that makes sense to be portrayed in either two styles, and with that success it was still enough to warrant a sequel, even though you wouldn't really care about this movie if it weren't for Glenn Close. And after that, it wouldn't be another 10 years until Disney started to remake their films yet again, with Alice in Wonderland directed by Tim Burton. Once again, it was another film that wasn't great but a huge success, making over $1 billion, where that reason alone is why it started this remake era off, because it's a story that people have heard of and wanted to see. And besides that fact, the reason why the films work so well with many audiences is because it took that wacky style of the original in a unique way with an older Alice, something that was really well suited for Tim Burton's style. It was distinctly different from the original film, and how unique the designs were into how they portrayed the characters like the Red Queen, from the Queen of Hearts with the big head this time. This was a film that was more of an adaptation of the original book and stories rather than the Disney movie itself, and you can clearly see that with what they were trying to take the story around, how during these early stages of the remakes they were still willing to approach things with a completely different look that doesn't feel quite different from where they wanted to go. They had a variety of ideas and elements that still worked to make it its own without copying the original homework, which of course was interesting to us as the audience at the time, but then of course they got greedy with what we saw later on. This influenced the early style of remakes to present a newer story without copying it completely, taking stories like Maleficent from the villain of Sleeping Beauty to be the main hero or anti-hero, if you would like to call her as that in this film, to be a more interesting spin that is still different but in the same vein of the original story. Compared to Alice, it's taking the Disney movie as the starting point, but also using that as the jumping off point to create something new and fresh. These ideas they originally had were somewhat unique to say the very least, slowly but surely constantly finding new ways to adapt the stories, which culminated in them doing Cinderella. And as we all know, Cinderella still remains to be Disney's best remake to this day, where it was the first real remake in the sense of the word since 101 Dalmatians, really based on the original story where it contains most of what it had from the beginning to end, while this one really did a lot more to satisfy the characters of the story, especially the prince and Kit, one that also didn't ruin the original in any way and actually strengthened that journey overall. It takes something more real and grounded and had minimal involvement from its animal characters to focus on the heart of the story of Cinderella, because the original film did leave a lot to be desired in that department, which things like this film actually provided overall, aiming for the real look from its world, its castle, the towns, and the characters themselves. It's a story that remains to be special because of that, and the only real justified remake in the sense of the word being a remake. Because Jungle Book would go back to taking liberties from the original story in its own style yet again, and that's why it also well liked in that regard, since at the very least it was something different to be offered from its original story. It had an interesting story and made clever use of its CGI animals to make it more believable to interact with Mowgli throughout. It still looks awful and I'm still not a fan of the film, but there was something in it that offered more than what the original actually provided. Where that one is fun, don't get me wrong, but it's just not actually as compelling as this version's actual story, which is also surprising because it was directed by Jon Favreau, who also did The Lion King later on, where that is one of the worst films of all time. And this caps off the first half of Disney's remake era. The films were still unique, taking something different from its animated predecessor, and didn't need to be tied down for shots or whatever because they wanted to adapt something different for the audiences, which of course most of us, including myself, accepted at the time. And if that was the case, then maybe they shouldn't have dived into the second half doing the most horrendous reimagining possible, beginning with Beauty and the Beast. I mean, it was an obvious choice to do it now, considering how successful they saw the previous films, which was all mostly well received, a time when we didn't question much of the decisions because of the creative ways they took the story, but this one really took the edge of being a shot-for-shot remake in the songs and the overall story beats. But this time, it's also all done in this pathetic manner. It isn't an egregious remake like the other films, but it was just so lackluster with what they did. Emma Watson's performance as Belle is also very pathetic with the way they wanted her character to be performed, and the singing that was just so awful in my opinion, and lacked any of the heart of the original performance by Paige O'Hara. And this was all distinctly because the Beast was the Beast, and what they did to Emma just all feels auto-tuned, removing any emotion whatsoever that the character is supposed to have and actually singing from the scene, which is what the goal of the remakes were now. This was the true ground zero to turn people against the remakes because they were willing to do it for the sake of it, and it actually worked at first, making $1.2 billion at the box office. The ingredients in it proved that it was working because it was familiar to the story, regarded as one of the best animated films of all time, something they knew wouldn't work if they strayed off the beaten path or tried to flesh it out in a new interesting way like the others, where you actually would agree with that point. Compared to the other last stories, it just seemed like the one that would benefit from being the same thing, where that's the thing that they would go doing and making other stories afterwards for the most part. Beauty and the Beast works because it actually has the elements that you loved about the original story. If you take those songs away, no one would actually watch it. And because people actually watched it because it had those elements, we started to get more billion-dollar successes, with a few minor actual flops in between, because they tried to do something different with Dumbo with Tim Burton again, but that one was just dumb because it was boring and it had nothing interesting to say about it, just done for this why not attitude because of the recent successes that proved no point in stopping because the positive reception of the other films, like what Aladdin did, continuing the same success, making another $1 billion as well because of how popular it was in places like Asia. This is where things start to get worse because it comes from Disney's greatest year where all the films they mostly released got billions of dollars. It was the most obvious choice being the film that followed Beauty and the Beast in the Renaissance with one of the most iconic characters ever made, but done in this way where they try to match Will Smith's genie to Robin Williams, since everything is done in vain of that. They couldn't have this story without most people thinking of that, and it really prevented Will's genie from being as good as it could have been, where he was the best part of the movie, as most people would say, that lacks in every other single area of its own story. Because the more you do one thing that reaches a certain formula, the more you want to do it, where this was the time I started to abandon these films because of what they were doing in that regard. They were starting to disrespect the medium of animation and kept doing this because they already had a collection of great successes in this genre, not doing too much from the original story because they realized they don't actually need to do it, only adding one minor new song and changes to be more progressive to its female characters. And the reason I say that it offers disrespect because the next film was in fact The Lion King, which came out the same exact very year. And this is the most disrespectful film that was ever made because it's an animated film. The highest grossing animated film right now, still nevertheless less despite what Disney wants us to believe. This is the one that showed how Disney wanted to make these films for the sake of making money more so than any other remake combined, because for some damn reason Jon Favreau went into making this movie to become a documentary that is less expressive than real life animals and what he did in the Jungle Book, and has no real charm to it whatsoever, with being a shot-for-shot remake, with Beyonce providing such utter dogshit for music and acting as well. It was really something that proved in our minds that the intention of these remakes were never for adding something of worth of value to the stories before, and that they were just there to bank off the old memories and laziness with zero creativity or passion because they don't know what else to do for their own live action department away from Marvel films or Star Wars films. Because as I'll mention a little bit later in this video, this started a new trend of remakes to be photorealistic and not live action at all. Films that have been announced like Bambi and Robin Hood. Nothing here is remotely interesting and you feel nothing because they have so many elements that are lacking trying to recapture that original animated characters who were animated in the sense they had clear emotions, compared to this film that has nothing devoid of any life to it at all. The only shot they have to say is live action in this film is only the first 2 seconds with the sun, and that's it. Where despite what Disney still keeps saying for this movie, this does not mean this film is live action in any way because you chose to do that. You chose to do something that also lacks in the same way, with the sun rising up in the original being bigger and grander and brighter to introduce the film. They just do it for the sake of laughing at us because we consume everything they touch and they want to remake the film. Because it's similar in the case of the next film being Lady and the Tramp, focusing on those two animated characters. The world is still real, but it still has these CGI animals that look disgusting. But to be fair, nobody should actually care about it at all because nobody really cares about the original compared to other Disney films and how it was released on Disney+. It's just very boring. It's not the worst remake, but it's just stupid. But it's a template where now they have this new streaming platform where they were free to release any film they could ever want that ever mattered to them. And of course, after this movie came Mulan, which really broke everything apart about their live action films. Another one of my least favorite films of all time, with how badly everything went wrong. Compared to every other adaptation that tells new ways to tell their stories, this one decided to do it by butchering everything about the character and the story that even the Chinese themselves actually hated it because of how grossly inaccurate the movie was. This is the film that I really want to cover extensive detail and begin my series on live action remakes slowly and explain why they suck because of how bad it truly was, because I love the original Mulan film. It's one of my favorite Disney films ever, where this is one I despise and loathe more than you can ever imagine. I mean, they certainly had an interesting intentions to take Mulan, but they took the most crucial elements of her character out that they made it overall pointless. This film's editing is probably one of the worst I've ever seen, but they did not care considering the human rights issues Disney ignored to make the film to try to cooperate with the despicable Chinese government to sell this film out. I mean, at the very least, COVID actually stopped people from seeing it in theaters where everything else about it and 2020 was awful, especially when they charged the premium access to actually see the film when it was released. It's exactly what you expect a remake to harbor, the absolute definition of removing everything that was great about the story, just the bare bones elements of being an actual movie, because like The Lion King, it isn't being made for being a movie or compelling story, and it's just being made for a quick buck to an already multi-billion-dollar corporation. And because of that, the quality started to get worse over time. They went back to making the villain the hero of the story in this prequel backstory that takes place in the 70s with films like Cruella, with Emma Stone giving a lackluster performance to become Cruella in the film compared to Glenn Close. I hate it because it lacks anything from a villain we've already known and seen who just wants to make fur coats out of Dalmatians just because they look luxurious or whatever, with the most stupidest things like Dalmatians pushing her supposed mother to death because her real mother actually wanted that to happen. It's stupid and it just represents how dumb these movies are. They just want to present their villains in a more positive and sympathetic light because they just can, because of what Maleficent brought in a new semi-creative way to try to justify to the audience that these remakes are valid pieces of art, which it's actually not. Because the next two films returns us back to Disney Plus solely with Pinocchio and Peter Pan, and those films were certainly completely awful, and you see why they decided to release it there. These films continue to do the Mulan formula by stripping everything away from the original film that was important in so many ways, making the world seem so barren and so awful. Pinocchio doesn't really learn anything because he actually lies to get out of situations and is portrayed as an already holier than thou in some scenarios, removing the effects of the original film too, like smoking and actual beer here to just respect kids' sensitivities, and Peter Pan and Wendy just misses every single point about Neverland and the Lost Boys and Captain Hook for the journey of their characters. These films are devoid of anything useful because they're just there to fill the content gap so that they can keep people on this streaming platform because they're incapable of fleshing out their stories very well anymore. And finally, it brings us back to the present day with The Little Mermaid being released, where this time Disney thought they would return to box office success after COVID with a story that everyone loves and started the renaissance, and one done with controversy because of Ariel's casting and the other elements of the film. This is where Disney liked to flex their muscles and power by using diversity or becoming progressive to attract people to the film because they can. Most of these films are meant to modernize the stories with zero of the heart or understanding of the original like this film did. It's not done because they care about the issues due to the divisive reaction or actually original stories that actually could benefit for these people. It's just done for the overall attention to see it because it kind of worked here in the States but sadly not anywhere else because of the fact they removed something that others know of the original or their own beauty standards and whatnot. Or if it was the other way around, it wouldn't stop the film from being brazenly awful in every single way. It showed more of how they just tried to continue making these films and decided to market different from changing the color of the character and other things just to actually sell it, but they failed in doing so, but still not stopping because there is an audience for it and what they're doing with Snow White. That they know there is a formula that works to actually get people to watch it despite their issues, because similarly it has the same problems as casting Rachel Zegler as the Latina version of the character that is named Snow White. And of course, the removal of the 7 dwarfs from the title, showcasing that this film is still removing elements from the original once again, the one that started animation being a success for Disney and every other animated film we see today being inspired because of what this did to change things. The tale of the original story also comes from Germany, and like The Little Mermaid also doesn't make sense, but they do it again to add this element that gets people talking about it regardless of what they learned, for the sole reason of being a remake that is realistic, retelling the original story in the most unreal way possible. There is just so many ways they could retell a story that they don't want to stop doing it, coupled with the fact that they can't stop, because that is now part of their company and brand overall. And this is the part of the video mentioning the other announced films, because if you go to the Wikipedia page right now, you can see their upcoming slate as of this recording in 2023 includes films like Moana, Lilo and Stitch, Mufasa, Hercules, Bambi, Sword in the Stone, Robin Hood, Aristocrats, and Hunchback. And like I mentioned before, you notice that 2 of these in Bambi and Robin Hood are actually like The Lion King being photorealistic, just really showing how much they really care about these films regardless of the intention of being live action films, because they are not. They're willing to create stories without human characters with the intention of making animals for the sake of it because of The Lion King, whereas a result without any of the emotions or human actors to actually justify it, it will be hollow with no purpose. Every film on this list has no merit to being remade at all, but they do it because of what we just learned and what I just talked about. It's just impossible for them to stop because it carries some success and provides content at the very least. And of course, the most egregious announcement out of this is of course Robin Hood itself, if you realize the original story that is based on a tale and has been adapted several times in real live action humans. Just doing it with these animals to be real doesn't make any sense. To actually be a photorealistic remake is absolutely stupid, and I don't know what they're thinking by making this film. It's like making Zootopia but just upping the ante to make it more real than ever possible, which now I said that, I think we're going to get a live action Zootopia sometime in the next few years, which I'm scared of. But this is where I want to talk about how they've been using their films for the wrong reasons when the stories they should be focusing on should be made, like Hunchback. Now I know a lot of people would disagree with this point, but if it were done right with the overall dark tone of the movie, it could work because it does take place in a real setting. But that's only if they remove things like the gargoyles and the tonal shifting comedy of the film in some areas and the adaptation of the original Hugo novel, to be an actual real mature story that can work as a good film like what Cinderella has provided. It has something that warrants it to being made because of how rich the story is without ruining the movie at all, and of course the play that actually takes a different look at the film with actually retaining the songs, since we all know they aren't going to stop doing any of these films at all. I have ideas that can be presented for the film to be the scariest ever film they've ever portrayed, with Frollo and the darkest of all, because it can reach that level, but only if they're willing to make it. It has those elements to be successful in its own right, to be mature and an excellent film, but that's only if they do that. And another one to mention that can work is how they will not touch Atlantis. This movie has such a grand world and style that can work in live action due to the scope and realism the story can be presented in a lost world. It makes more sense because the journey and the world around it really adds something more that can be discovered. It's so interesting and adds so many lores to one of the most underrated Disney films ever made. Like, it really is one of their best films that is still overlooked by many because of the other princess stories actually performed, which actually technically this one is also. Please guys, give justice to Kita. It's literally a story that has everything they want with a diverse crew of characters and an interesting premise and world, and more importantly, one that works within live action because it has solely human characters. But the only thing stopping them from doing so was the fact it was a box office disappointment, which means they won't remake the film because it doesn't make enough money for them to actually justify it, which doesn't make sense now because they marketed The Little Mermaid and that hardly is going to give them any money because of their bloated budgets. It's not the billion-dollar success that they were expecting because of those failures. Instead of going for the obvious actual compelling story choices, they go after the safer ones that are more successful, including in the modern era like Moana, one done earlier because of The Rock and nothing else, where they realistically would have went for Frozen instead, but just doing a third film to the most botched franchise ever that just makes money, that prints them whatever they want in merchandise. I've already explained why I hate this decision for another film I love as one of the greatest Disney films ever, but it's just hard not to bring up those facts that are now sped up and prove how they cannot nor will not stop doing so. But it just makes no logical sense to do this overall because it's a 3D film where most of the newer films try to look more real as possible while being cartoonish as well. It just doesn't work because it's done to fulfill the egos of the executives and The Rock. And it's coming just after the premiere of a Disney Plus spin-off series of Moana in 2024 that is 1 year before the film comes out, which doesn't make sense unless you put it from the perspective of trying to turn Moana into a franchise, which is absolutely stupid because it feels unnecessary to compare and contrast the two previous films I mentioned before in Hunchback and Atlantis because the world they built actually makes sense if done right, but many elements that made Moana successful was the zany action of the characters that are done in this realistic fashion, which already dumbs down this film because of what it's trying to be based on. It just looks completely stupid and has no justification for its existence at all because we've already experienced that, and doing this will make it quite useless. Because this is going to bring us back to films like The Black Cauldron from Disney's Dark Age, how in 2016 they actually acquired the rights to making films of the Chronicles of Pride Dane again, which The Black Cauldron is actually based on, to try to make it into a film series too, which could actually also work. It has the ingredients that could work as the Disney Plus series as well, with how much they could have offered in the style being their own high fantasy epic series. There has been no news about it now, but they do have it and they actually should do it because it makes more sense to flesh out that entire story rather than these soulless remakes that keep decreasing in quality. There's so much to offer in that story that hasn't been explored from the first Black Cauldron that leaves more to be seen. Just like how I mentioned in Cinderella, that story had more to be offered that they explored in the live action remake. They have the tools and materials to make things work that didn't work at first, but they don't even care to use it at all, which is so baffling to actually think about. They want to go forth to readapt stories like Hercules, but they don't want to do it for stories like Atlantis instead that are more grounded to begin with. Of course, at the very least, they won't remake Pocahontas because Alan Menken said it would be impossible to modern sensitivities, which actually makes sense within the original story and the real history, in context which would not be a good thing for Disney to actually do or the public discourse at all. It would make things 10 times worse than Snow White or The Little Mermaid's controversies combined. But I guess remaking Bambi is okay because the story is so emotional and we saw how well that worked out for The Lion King in that entire realm, where this one had no real villain whatsoever, unless you could consider The Unseen Man from Bambi one of the greatest films of all time for some reason. But at the very least, this video should absolutely serve as the template to justify some films actually existing on the basis of being real, while the others have provided absolutely nothing. They could, but they just don't want to because they only want the money out of them, where if they just realized the story is what matters the most that these films don't have, then they probably would have been entirely fine, but still only done because they cannot stop doing so and will not because they hate the medium of animation and 2D in this modern age. And because of that, other studios like Universal are actually remaking their own films like from DreamWorks to How to Train Your Dragon, and something we will have to live with years to come for that damn reason. With that said, Disney has ruined animated films. I'm all done. Goodbye.